Today on AGetc, we start with some KSU soybean research about soybean, flour, and baking quality. Next, we have a three-part series with Sarah Place, PhD Senior Director of Sustainable Beef Production Research with the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, who discusses the facts about greenhouse gases within the beef industry. Then we end with Darin Williams, a farmer in Waverley, Kansas, who talks about soil health and why he decided to try raising non-GMO soybeans. Stay with us.
Closed captioning brought to you by Ag Promo Source. Together we grow. Learn more at agpromosource.com. This segment brought to you by Kansas Regenerative Medicine. Your stem cells, your health, your life.
I'm Yonghui Li. I'm a assistant professor from Green Science at K-State. So really my research on the baking science, cereal chemistry and baking science. We work a lot with wheat, but also with soy. So the reason why we use soy, because there's a need for a gluten-free bakery product. A lot of people, they want gluten-free. Because of celiac disease, and some because of the gluten sensitive, and some because they thought gluten-free is better for their health. So there's a very strong growth of the gluten-free market. That's why we want to use soy into this bakery to see if we could utilize a lot of soy as a major and as a primary ingredient in the gluten-free bakery. So for the first year, we are working on a bread, bread products. We call those as a yeast leavened product, bread, buns, rolls, those type of products. And then for the next year, we propose to work on other type, we call those as chemically leavened products. So you look at the cookies, crackers, cakes, biscuits, so on and so forth. So for the first year, we actually have been making very good progress. We start in July 1st this year, and then we hire a master student and start in about August. So he's working on the bread development. So we kind of adjust all the formula. We use some base flour, and then we develop a very nice base formula, and then we replace different amount of the base flour with soy flour, from 10% to 50%. We do see, with the normal formulation, you are going to have a lower volume with the replacement of the base flour with soy flour. So that's why we are working on, with a different combination of those ingredients. We are working with gums, with hydrocolloids, emulsifiers, enzymes, and all those type of, of the ingredients to improve the formulation property with soy flour. And then we are still working on that, but by the end of the first year, we will develop some nice formulation with soy at least 40 to 50% of the base flour. We are going to measure those volume, the texture, how they really feel, taste, and also their shelf life and their nutritional aspects. And then for next year, we'll move to other type of the bakery. So hopefully with the completion of the 2-year project, we will cover the application of soy in those major types of bakery, and we will develop all those needed science, technology, all the information for those interested parties who want to use soy in their, or make that commercially available. Definitely, there are a lot of challenges. That's why there's not commercially used. There's very little information available. Use soy as a major baker because soy is different from wheat. The wheat have very nice gluten. Gluten, they make the dough very stretching, very elastic, very viscous. All those make the bread and bakery nice. But soy without gluten, it's a challenge. That's why we work with all those formulation, all those ingredients, and the pre-treatment to make it functional as close to wheat as possible. That's the science, the science and development work, how we solve the science problem.
Ag Promo Source is a unique group of marketing specialists with one mission: help your ag business grow. Each affiliate has their own area of expertise, and they work together to bring you advice, products, and services. To get started, visit agpromosource.com. Ag Promo Source. Together we grow.
This segment brought to you by Kansas Wheat. Learn more at rediscoverwheat.org.
So just kind of transitioning a little bit over to this whole greenhouse gas idea. Again, just putting this up here because this is definitely something that if you follow this topic, you're going to hear a lot about, right? Again, this is kind of the favorite topic that we get kind of covered on when it comes to a sustainability standpoint. So what about these gassy cows, right? This whole idea of enteric fermentation. Just a few things, again, kind of preaching to the choir here, but the one thing I always say to any audience, it's always like, just if you hear somebody saying cow farts, just please correct them that it doesn't come out the back end, right? It comes out the front end of the animal, right? It's more properly cow burps, or eructation is the technical term for the process of what happens. Of course, cattle, sheep, goats, they have a large fermentation vat as their stomach, right? Their first stomach compartment, the rumen. It's just teeming with trillions of microorganisms, and those microbes are going to produce a lot of gas. They produce a lot of CO2. Some of them produce methane gas, right? That's going to collect in the animal's headspace. Ideally, at least once a minute, there's going to be some contractions that are going to remove that gas, right? So that's a natural process, natural part of their ability to take this human inedible material, right? It's a trade-off of this process. The other thing that's key to know and remember is that essentially it's kind of counter to what a lot of news media articles would suggest, that as animals eat more high fiber diets, they make more methane, right? So when cattle are out grazing or when they're eating hay, they're going to be making more methane as compared to animals that are going to be in a feedlot situation, a finishing situation, eating a grain-based diet. So the more fermentable starch that is in an animal's diet, the more concentrate, the lower the methane emissions. And that's actually one of the most consistent ways that we know how to lower methane emissions is feeding more concentrate to ruminant animals. But there we have this trade-off, right, where we're using more human inedible stuff, or human edible stuff potentially, right, to lower methane emissions. So there is no free lunch in any of this when it comes to all these different issues that we sometimes get criticized for in the beef industry. What's also important is to kind of step back and look at the bigger picture, right, in terms of we hear all this about greenhouse gas emissions from cattle. How big of a source are they really in the United States, okay? So this information comes from the U.S. EPA's greenhouse gas emission inventory. So these are the direct emissions that come from cattle. So this is emissions of the methane that we just talked about and any emissions that come from their manure, okay? So about 2% of greenhouse gas emissions directly come from cattle, beef cattle in the United States. Landfills are roughly equivalent, okay, in terms of all the gases that come from them. Transportation, about 25%, 26% changes year to year. Electricity is close to 30%, and all the other sources add up there too. So just to give you also a frame of reference, all of agriculture in the United States is about 9% of emissions, okay? So again, it's far less than transportation, far less than all these other things that we do to burn fossil fuels, non-essential things essentially that we're doing, right? Our essential things that we're doing of producing food for people are about 9% of emissions. What's also important is that things aren't static, right? Emissions have gone down over time in the U.S. beef cattle industry, and really that's been driven by productivity. So there's lots of different numbers here on the screen, but this is just giving you an idea of comparing when we had our largest cattle herd in the United States in 1975 in terms of total beef and dairy cattle compared to 2016, right? So there's a few different things that are on the screen here. The first up top is essentially emission intensity, right? So how many greenhouse gas emissions get produced per unit of beef? And you can see that that's gone down 33%. Second is just the total amount of direct emissions coming from the industry, and this is all information from the UNFAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, so those have gone down 31%. Total beef production is roughly the same though, right? So we're producing the same amount of beef with over a third fewer animals, right? And that's really what's driven down those emissions. And I just threw in, just for fun, right, the number of people in the United States has gone up over 100 million people, right, in those 40 years. So that is something that's a big change and obviously driving a lot of things as well. And even when we zoom out beyond just beef cattle, right, this is a success story of American agriculture, American animal agriculture, right? So again, this is information from the UNFAO, but just looking at from 1961 to 2016, the total greenhouse gas emissions, these aren't greenhouse gas emissions per unit of product, but total emissions have gone down 12%, right? 12% decline, and yet we produce 89% more meat, milk, and eggs in America, right? So that's super impressive. And again, these are these kind of facts that we definitely do need to share with people. And this is not stuff that we come up with, right? Again, this is publicly available data from the UN, from the FAO. So great success story in terms of reducing total emissions, which definitely has not happened in sectors like transportation, for example, right? Those emissions just keep going up.
Sure Crop Fertilizers was started by my father, Don Sherman, and my mother, Shirley Sherman. Family business that started in the 80s. We predominantly focus on plant nutrients and what we can do to give growers better responses with the fertilizer dollars that they do, and what we can do to make those things work better for the grower. We're based out of Waverley, Kansas. We work with growers in their soil analysis to figure out what they need, and then we can put those in a blend that gives them the best results, and so that we can deliver that direct to their farm so that they have those nutrients where they need them, when they need them, and so that they can apply them in a manner that's very efficient to them and works well in their planting systems and what they're doing. Sure Crop Fertilizers has been around for a long time. We always say we're big enough to take care of everything you need, but we're small enough to do it quickly. You can get a hold of us at 1-800-635-4743. Our website is surecropfertilizers.com, and you can always email me at Corey@surecropfertilizers.com, and with any questions you have, we're glad to answer it and work with you.
The new Better Horses Network is worldwide, presented by Lucas Oil, featuring worldwide radio and TV with iconic hosts like Al Dunning, Sharon Camarillo, Ernie Rodina, Lindy Birch, and Craig Cameron. With American Cowboy, Horse and Rider, Brushy Creek, Cavenders, and Ride TV. Worldwide radio and TV, the all-new Better Horses Network.
Valley Vet Supply is devoted to providing information and professional quality products at reasonable prices.
Valley Vet Supply.
This segment brought to you by Sure Crop, liquid crop nutrition delivered right to your farm.
So just one more historical comparison, just because I like these. But compared to 1909, right? I started this off with this quote from Dr. Armsby. So what was happening in 1909 compared to close to today, right? What are the changes that have taken place in the United States? So the U.S. population has increased from 90 million to over 320 million, right? In those over 100 years. Good news, right? Our life expectancy's increased. Mostly, a lot of that's driven by, right, not having young children die. That's a good thing. But check out our number of motor vehicles registered, right? That's gone up 84,000%. Seems like that might be an issue, right? The number of motor vehicles per person has gone up 27,000%, and the number of cattle per person has gone down 58%. Okay. So some facts that are publicly available information to share with people, right? In terms of, it's not that the beef industry doesn't have an impact from a greenhouse gas emission perspective or any other perspective. It's just putting it in context, right? There's lots of other things in our economy that are contributing far greater to this issue of greenhouse gas emissions than cattle. And coming back to this whole idea of upcycling and nutrient density, I think this is super important for people in the beef industry to be advocates for as well, right? We need to tell that story about why beef is so important from a standpoint, or animal source foods are so important from a standpoint of human nutrition and health. So this is just information looking at our animal source foods, so meat and poultry, fish, dairy products, and eggs, and looking at energy that they contribute in the average American diet, which is about 23-25%, somewhere in that neighborhood, and then all the nutrients that they're providing, right, that are over 25%, right? So they have a lower calorie cost, and that's a good thing, because we have some disturbing statistics with obesity, but also things, just indicators of metabolic health in Americans, where we have 50% of American adults either have diabetes or prediabetes. 50%, right? There was another study that came out in November looking at just overall metabolic health of Americans and found that 88% of Americans are not metabolically healthy, right? Looking at things like blood pressure and waist circumference. So we really need to turn this whole sustainability discussion away from, we need to produce more calories. We do not need to produce more calories, right? We need more nutrient-dense food, rich food for the United States, for around the world, and that's what livestock do, right? They concentrate those nutrients and give them to us at a lower calorie cost.
I had this horse, it was a good horse, except when the wind was blowing above 30 miles an hour. The wind was blowing about 35, 40, and I saddled him up, rode him out to the end of the lane, and I thought, well, he's doing pretty good. And about 6 jumps later, I was laying on the ground and thinking, boy, my shoulder sure hurt. I kept waiting, and it didn't get better, and so I went to orthopedic surgeon, and that showed that I had torn rotator cuff. And said, well, we'll have to do surgery. I thought, I farm and ranch by myself. This is not going to work out very well. I'd been sleeping in my recliner for about 2.5 years because it hurt too much to sleep in bed on my side. I'd heard about Kansas Regenerative Medicine Center on the radio. Gotten down there at 8 o'clock in the morning, and by 11:30 the procedure was all over. They just took some fat out of my side here and spun that down for about 45 minutes and then injected it in my shoulders, and I was on my way. It's something you don't hear about, but I thought it was worth a try, and I'm really pleased. It's really worked out well for me.
This segment brought to you by Kansas Corn. Learn more at kscorn.com.
And just bringing this all together in this whole nutrition and greenhouse gas emission issue and this whole idea of upcycling, this is a really interesting study that came out in the fall of 2017 that was published in the Proceedings of the National Academies of Sciences. And essentially, 2 animal scientists looked at this whole idea that is out there, right, of meatless Mondays, right, or less meat, less heat. They put it to the most extreme tests. They said, what if we could reduce meat consumption completely to zero, right? What if we had no livestock and every American, including, oh, by the way, the 140 million cats and dogs that are in America, are also now all vegans, right? Everybody has to eat a plant-based diet. What would actually happen with greenhouse gas emissions, okay? So you can see the headline at the top there, right? We would reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 2.6%, okay, in the United States. And I put in parentheses what that is globally. Okay, what it's equivalent to globally. So less than 0.5%. We would produce more pounds of food, we would produce more calories, but we wouldn't have enough essential micronutrients to actually nourish everybody in our food supply if we had no animals, right? And of course, a big one there is vitamin B12. There is no vitamin B12 without animal source foods. And that's really important for cognition, right, for memory, right? So we'd have really overfed people that would have mental issues. So it could be a problem. But we would reduce greenhouse gas emissions, right? So that's all that matters. So that's super important. The other thing that's going on the screen in terms of this bar chart is why this paper I think is really good is because it looked at some of those unintended consequences. What if you get rid of livestock? What actually happens, okay, with greenhouse gas emissions? So looking at this bar chart, the plus animals is our current situation, right? And if you can't see the scale, the main thing to look at is that big blue chunk are the greenhouse gas emissions that come from animal agriculture. And then the minus animal situation is this vegan scenario, right, where we get rid of all livestock. And the key takeaway here is you don't just remove those emissions from animals, right? You're going to have to add back some things that you're not accounting for. Like if we have no animals, we have no animal manure, right? So we're going to have to rely a lot more on synthetic fertilizer. We're going to have to rely more on legumes, both for our own nutrition in terms of protein, but also adding back more nitrogen in our soils, right? And this is just greenhouse gas emissions. This isn't looking at all the ripple effects that would happen probably with grassland conditions and with soil erosion, right? All those other problems that we would probably have. And then finally, the last thing I'll just say on this is this assumes all livestock would disappear, right? So the cows cannot go to a petting sanctuary, right, where everybody's going to pet them 3 times a day, right? Because then they'll still be belching out methane, right? So this is super important, right? We have to have one last giant barbecue, and then that's it, okay? So that's super important, again, because if we're talking about some of these scenarios of meatless Mondays or one person reducing their meat consumption to do right by the environment, I don't want to be a Debbie Downer to them, but if you don't eat beef, most likely somebody else is going to eat that beef you were going to eat, right? All the emissions happened a couple of years before, and you as an individual cannot change the entire U.S. beef supply chain or the global beef supply chain, right? Even if you are an important person, right? That's just not how it works. So this is really important from a standpoint of talking about these environmental scenarios, is oftentimes they ignore all these indirect effects and unintended consequences.
Kim Mannering with Hardy Insurance. Today we will talk about umbrella coverage. Did you know that if your cattle get out, you could be held liable for that? Call me. Let's have a discussion. 316-945-6733.
KFRM is one of the largest farm radio stations in the nation, dedicated to informing and entertaining rural listeners from northern Oklahoma to southwestern Nebraska. You can catch KFRM in many ways. Of course, 550 on the AM dial, streaming at kfrm.com, or on your smartphone by going to the TuneIn Radio app, or on Ag AM in Kansas on Tuesdays and Facebook every day of the week. KFRM, tune us in. You'll be glad you did.
This segment brought to you by Kansas Soybean Commission. Progress powered by Kansas farmers.
Well, my name's Darin Williams, and we farm in Waverley, Kansas, on the east central side of the state of Kansas. We got into no-till and cover crops back in 2010 at the same time, and it just intrigued me to see if we could grow conventional or non-GMO soybeans and achieve the same yields as the Roundup Ready, 1 or 2s that were out at that time. So I started doing soybean plots under no-till conditions so I could get my own yield data, and I was putting Roundup Ready in with non-GMO seed. And then after several years of making a lot of phone calls and building a lot of relationships, we're finally at the point where we can market 3 to 4 different varieties that we sell at our seed facility, Natural Ag Solutions. And I've not seen the yield drag that a lot of people say is there. It's a different way of managing the crop and growing it, but it doesn't work unless you have healthy soil. Whether you're growing dicamba or genetically modified, you still have to have healthy soil to grow a crop, a good healthy crop. And it just seemed like a natural thing to do since we were learning no-till and cover crops at the same time to see, it was more out of a curiosity thing to see if we could do it. And now that we've gotten farther into it and we've seen the profitability that's there, it has helped because there's some tough times with the grain prices and stuff the last 3 or 4 years, and capitalizing on anywhere from 50 to 75 cents over the futures price is a big deal on a substantial amount of acres, but it's not been without a lot of blood and sweat and a lot of determination to make it happen. So what we do for a cover crop is we plant rye or triticale or barley in the fall after we get our corn crop off, or if we're going to go back to beans after we harvest the soybeans, we no-till that in the fall. That grows up in the spring, and then we no-till our soybeans directly into that cover crop in the springtime. If we cannot, like this year where it's really wet and muddy and we couldn't get anything planted in the fall, we'll use oats in the springtime. We'll let those grow up and get right to that soft dough stage, and then we'll just no-till our beans right into that. And a lot of times we can do that without having to post-spray any chemical over the top. If we need to, we will, but we make it with a strategic strike, not a prolific use of the chemical. Do I have any trouble with dicamba drift? And that's a legitimate concern, that's a legitimate question. And my answer is I've had a small amount of damage. I've had 4 acres in the last 2 years of dicamba being used around me that got damaged. But I spend a lot of time letting my neighbors know what I'm growing. And most of them know I'm growing non-GMO crops, and they do a pretty good job of trying to be extra careful, around our crops. So it's not been a huge issue to me. But, I realize neighbors don't always get along, but we try to do our best to let neighbors know what we're doing, and landowners. I have a renter, that I rent from. I'm happy to share with them, or somebody across the road sees us spraying something, I'm happy to go right across the road and share with them what I'm actually doing in the field. I think communicating with people in more of a humble learning fashion than an arrogant, I'm going to do what I'm going to do because I'm the farmer and you're just going to have to live with it fashion, it gets you a lot farther down the road. And I just think communicating is a big deal. I don't know everything. I'm still learning. We've been trying to do this for almost 8 to 9 years now. And that's how I got started, was going to different events across the country, different farms, trying to learn from what other producers were doing. I knew I couldn't exactly duplicate everything they're doing. You can't go to Gabe Brown's farm and say, okay, I'm going to do what Gabe Brown does right now, because he's put several years into getting there. You can take those principles, you can go back to your farm and start applicating them on your farm. I think it's important because the future of agriculture is in trouble. And if we don't get these younger people, what I consider the generation, the 30, 35-year-old people thinking different about how they're growing their crops, we're going to be in a big trouble, in another 10 or 15 years, overall financially and ecologically.
Closed captioning brought to you by Ag Promo Source. Together we grow. Learn more at agpromosource.com.